My name's Jim Nevin. My sobriety date is February 14th, 1983, and I'm here this morning with Edward Train Caldwell, who started the other bar in Northern California. His sobriety date is November 23rd, 1976. So what I wanted to do is perhaps, Ed, you would tell us how you came to the point on November 23rd of 1976 that you realized you needed recovery.
Well, my name is Ed Caldwell. I knew I had a drinking problem at a very young age. I actually started drinking when I was in grammar school. I would help my folks who would have cocktail parties, and I would clean up the glasses, and I would always pour myself a little bit and get a little buzz on. So that was really the beginning of my era of drinking when I was a relatively young man. It developed into a real serious problem where I felt I had to do something or I was going to be in trouble. And that's when I decided to go to Alcoholics Anonymous. And the first Alcoholics Anonymous meeting that I ever recall attending was at Zim's restaurant back in, I'm not sure what the year was.
Would have been shortly after your sobriety, I think,
in
November 1976.
76.
Let me back you up a little bit if I can, Ed. In November 1976, when you first got into recovery, my understanding is you were practicing law. Well, my understanding is I drank with you at the Flatboard Saloon. So you were at the Whitcomb Hotel
At the
in
Whitcomb
downtown San
Hotel,
Francisco.
yeah.
Okay. So one of your first meetings was actually in your law office, wasn't it?
That's right.
Tell us about that, if you
Yeah, well, first off, the Whitcomb Hotel, we had law offices up in the penthouse, and we would just take an elevator down, and we end up in the bar downstairs. And it was a traditional part of most of the lawyers that worked in the tower.
Well, let's limit it to the question of the first meeting.
Okay.
Though, without naming the names, those who had an alcohol problem or those who were in recovery
Right.
you started meeting with them in the building itself.
Exactly. Upstairs at the penthouse is where we met. There was about 6 of us together that were on the trail of sobriety.
At some point, shortly after your sobriety date in 76, you moved your office to 100 Van Ness.
That's correct.
And 100 Van Ness was the old AAA building.
That's correct.
Who allowed some space, and the other bar meeting began on Monday nights at the AAA building in
That's
the late
exactly
70s.
right, Jim. Yeah.
That was the origin.
Mm-hmm. That was the first other bar.
Do you remember can you tell us how you came up with the name the other bar? My memory is that you were working with a small group, one of whom was Roy Harris.
Mm-hmm.
And Roy's the one that came up with you, sitting around tell us the story.
Well, we're sitting around thinking about, we're throwing out names as to what we think the organization should be called. And I think Roy was the one that first mentioned the name Other Bar. And immediately all of us collectively said, hey, that's terrific. It covers both areas. And so that was where it initiated. Roy was the one that actually introduced the name Other Bar.
Okay.
So that's how that started.
Well, there's also a story you tell from the early days, because as you know, I've heard your story a few times, that somewhere early in your recovery, you decided to help other attorneys. And one of your entrees to those attorneys was to write a letter. Tell us that story.
Oh yeah, that was bad news. I would write letters to lawyers who I suspected had serious drinking problems. Dear Mr. So-and-so, and then we believe, I've heard through the streets or rumors that you're having a problem with alcohol. And if you are, please give me a call because we'd love to help you and you help us.
And you found that wasn't particularly successful?
No, it was. I got a lot of criticism.
Okay.
They were not too happy with that.
Early in your recovery, and again the early days of the other bar, when you now moved to Van Ness, I believe the timing is, you became involved with a man by the name of Norwood Grisham. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, Norwood Grisham was an individual who was very helpful to the initial beginning of the other bar and AA. He was an AA grad himself. He was a very interesting man, and he was very helpful in getting our groups together in a kind of a conclusive manner, so we were all on the same page. Grish was, that's what he was called. His nickname was Grish. He was a big influence because he was the one that set up meetings, and he was the one that would have speakers come in, and he was a big force in my sobriety at the outset of my sobriety.
The other one with Grish is, as I understand it, is you began working with the state bar in
Right.
some capacity, seeking a relationship that worked for attorneys who had trouble with alcohol or drug
Exactly.
issues, and were influential in getting a contract for Grish with the state bar to
Mhm.
become a consultant in the area, working with attorneys and recovery issues.
That's correct. Now I moved my office from the Market Street location over to Van Ness Avenue, and we had a meeting upstairs above my one floor up from my office in Van Ness Avenue, and that was what I considered to be the first meeting of the other bar, and that was regularly attended by lawyers from downtown San Francisco, the financial district, and the few lawyers that there were on Van Ness Avenue, and it was almost maximized from the very beginning. It turned into be a pretty full house.
So one of the things that that group decided, and I think there's enough of the numbers of attendees, if you will, at the AAA building meeting to start a meeting in Marin County, because enough lawyers lived in Marin County would commute into San Francisco. So you located the Zims on Sir Francis Drake, right off the 101.
That's absolutely correct, Jim. And that Zims was fun because we'd go in there and we'd have a nice hearty breakfast and we'd all share.
Actually, my first meeting with the other bar was at Zims, and we were still outside in the general restaurant area because as we grew, we moved it to the back room. But you're right, I think a lot of the success had to do with the breakfast meeting, 7:30 to 8:30. Zims was very good to us. They gave us a private room, and we ended up in being able to hold intimate meetings, if you will, over breakfast, and it just grew.
Yeah. It was it was a very accommodating place for us. I mean, we had this whole room to ourselves, and we had a chance to eat breakfast. We had a chance to joke around, and we had meetings. It was a wonderful beginning of the road to sobriety. And as I say, I can still remember when a newcomer would come in, we'd say, "Well, you really got to stay sober. Look what happened to this guy." And those were really good days. In that period of time, we were adding members, as I recall, Jim.
Oh, we were adding members. Maybe it's a good time for me to talk about my introduction to you and the other bar. As I referred to earlier, you know, when I became a young attorney, you were already a friend of my brother Ed, who's an attorney. And I used to run with you a little bit as the new kid on the block. And so I did some drinking with you at the Black Bike Saloon. And what was the place on Petrarch Alley?
Yeah.
In any event, February 14th, 1983 is my sobriety date. And what I remember vividly is I knew that you were not drinking anymore. And I knew that you were doing something successfully in the recovery community to take care of your own needs and stay clean and sober. And so within a couple of days, February 14th, 1983, within 2 days, I would say, I was at the Marin County Courthouse, and I saw you down the corridor.
I remember that very
well. I haven't drank now for 24 hours, 48 hours, and I saw you, and I made a beeline to you, and I came down, and I said, "Ed, I'm an alcoholic, I need help." And you put your arms around me and gave me a hug and said, "Welcome home, Jimmy." And I knew I was home.
I remember that.
I'll never forget that role you played throughout my recovery, really, but certainly those early days.
Yeah.
Because you welcomed me home, and that's truly where I was.
Yeah, I certainly remember that, Jim. I remember distinctly walking by each other, and I stopped, and I remember telling you, and it just thrilled me that you were participating in the program, and you've been a big help through the years. And we've all pitched in to recruit new members, etc. And the other bar has been, I really look back to the days at Zims where not only was it was very important to be clean and sober and go to a meeting at Zims, but the other part, having breakfast was even more attractive. And that was kind of fun.
One of the things that was working with you and Grisham and going to meetings and having a sponsor. You and Grisham, if anything, were my first sponsors reading the big book, working the steps. And I'm well within my first year of sobriety, and you called me one day and said, Jimmy, the IJ wants to do a story in the other bar. Are you willing to go public? And I had to think that over for a minute, what going public meant, but of course I said, sure. So you and I found ourselves being interviewed by an independent journal reporter for the County of Marin's newspaper. And of course the first thing they want to know is, well, are you willing to tell your last name? So yes, you both of us decided if we're going to go this far, we might as well go all the way, and we tell our names and they interview us. Well, 3 years later, I get a call from an attorney, and he asked me for help. Jim, I'm an alcoholic. I need some help. So I responded like we always did to those folks doing the 12-step work. And during the course of my first meeting with him, I said, how did you get my name? And he opened up his wallet and pulled out a copy of the article from the IJ newspaper that he'd been carrying in his wallet for 3 years until he was ready to call for help. And I never forgot that story because it just took away the anonymity problem for me. In that, if I can help another, they need to know that I'm available for help. And you got me into that process also, Ed, for which I am grateful. So we'll back up a little bit again. We're working with Grisham now, who's retained by the State Bar of California. And Grisham's working with you in Northern California. And one of the things, as I recall, that he did was start to organize groups similar to what you had done in San Francisco that are now existing around the state. Judge Bill Beard, now deceased, God rest his soul, was a wonderful man, had started working with attorneys and other judges for that matter in San Diego County. And Ted Cohen was working with Jack Sano, who was working with attorneys in the Los Angeles area. So Grisham, with your assistance, started to organize these other groups that had started around the state. Do you remember that?
I sure do. It was interesting how it started sprouting up and spreading. And we seem to, I go back for a bit here. It all turned out to be a good thing. Grish was a big shaker and mover in keeping us together and helping our group be united and progress forward. I look back on it, and this was the cornerstone of my sobriety. There's no question about it. I mean, I went to AA, I went to the other, but the other bar was really the grounding of me for the future that I wasn't really anticipating, but I really grabbed it because it was so enjoyable.
Let me discuss another area that as I recall, now the other bar is working with Grish and you, and you're starting to bring in the other groups from around the state who are doing similar type work. And one of the themes, as I recall, was some attorneys were reluctant to go to Alcoholics Anonymous because of the anonymity question. And we always considered the other bar a bridge to Alcoholics Anonymous. If we could attract people to sobriety with other attorneys or attorneys and judges, we can invite them into the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is the cornerstone of all recovery. So all of us basically are involved in Alcoholics Anonymous. We just use the other bar as the invitation, if you will, to people who are otherwise reluctant to become public. The other thing with Norwood Grisham was the state bar was in a position where they were starting to recognize alcohol and drugs as a problem and really didn't know what to do about it. And so what they had was the other bar as a group of people who were beginning to work with attorneys and judges in the sobriety field, helping each other get clean and sober, helping each other stay clean and sober. And we started to work with each other to develop a program at the state bar level. Thus, they started the Committee on Alcohol and Drug Abuse, which I was a member of for a couple of years from the Board of Trustees. And we're uniting the groups around the state and starting the 800 numbers so that people had somebody they can call and get an answer, get a response anywhere in the state. But the state bar was dipping its feet, if you will, into recovery issues because they realized that lives are being lost and practices were being lost that could otherwise be saved if they could respond preventatively instead of punitively.
Well, that's very true, Jim. And I think that we were, I don't think any of us really enthusiastically supported the idea of a shot of sobriety or any shot of sobriety was a fund for those who didn't have sufficient funds to get sober or needed some treatment or needed income. But surprising to me is that I finally took to sobriety in such a way that I really embraced it, and I really was really out soliciting people who, wait a minute, I'm not an alcoholic yet. And so people would kind of step away from me. Here comes Caldwell. He's gonna try to do a 12-step.
Grab you by the collar.
Yeah, he's gonna grab you by the collar. But it really was very gratifying in the sense that we were kind of informal, but looking back, we were formal enough.
You mentioned the shot of sobriety a couple of minutes ago, and tell us that was one of your brainstorms, another idea of a program that you started. What's the shot of sobriety, and how did it start?
Well, the shot of sobriety started as a separate fund. We would all donate money, contribute to the meeting. We would all put money in a basket, and the money was, we had a treasurer, and the treasurer would put it in the bank, and the shot of sobriety was the title of that, and the purpose of that was for those who needed to go to treatment but didn't have the funding to go to treatment. They could get an IOU from the shot of sobriety fund, and we would give them, pay for their wherever they went for treatment. That fund was used to help and support people who were in treatment.
One of the stories that I also wanted to discuss with you, and you may remember this, Grish, as part of those old days in the uniting of the entire state, if you will, as best we could, came up with a weekend retreat, which is probably a precursor to our annual network. In fact, it was a precursor to the annual networking. So we had a weekend retreat at the Presentation Novitiate in Los Gatos, where we held the first meeting of the incorporators of the other bar. I have a copy of those incorporation papers, but all the other bar members who were attending that weekend signed a document in 1985 where for the first time the other bar now is going to become a nonprofit corporation officially. But the point is, at that point, now we're launched as a nonprofit corporation, which put us in a position to continue to work at even a more intimate level with the state bar. As I recall, what we did was incorporate, and then the state bar started funding us as a nonprofit corporation, and we retained as an independent contractor Norwood Grisham, and then started branching out as the budget allowed with some other part-time. Well, we'll backtrack again, because it's some of my most enjoyable days in recovery. Not that, I mean, they're all glorious now, but when we started in the other bar, we were a loose-knit organization. We had Norwood Grisham working with us. We created an 800 number. And as I recall, the 800 number would ring into Grish, and depending on where the call for help or the 12-step need was, we'd spread it out around the state now that we've starting to organize and be able to respond. So in those early days, Grisham would travel. I can remember being the one to answer the 800 numbers on occasion, which is always fun around the house because my children grew up knowing that Dad is in recovery, and when people needed him, people needed him. But the 800 number invited us to do 12-step work. Oftentimes there'd be an attorney that needed recovery but needed someone to cover his practice. So we could drop somebody into a treatment program and go through their files to make sure they weren't missing statute of limitations. Have something available for them to come back to if there was much to come back to after their treatment stay.
His job was to help those newcomers who were having difficult times and staying sober. And Grish would go out and see them and then take them under his wing and follow up with these people on a regular basis. And consequently, the members of the other bar grew because of Grish's 12-step calls. So that, to a great extent, that's how it worked.
And you introduced me to Grisham.
Yeah.
And Grisham actually became my first sponsor. And you're right, he was very influential in putting people to work immediately on getting clean and sober. I don't know whether you recall this, but my feelings at the time was I was pretty young for those days. It's not so much young nowadays because people are getting clean and sober younger and younger all the time. Um, but you put me to work immediately. You got me up in front of people. I was doing 12-step calls. I was giving presentations. You got me into the independent journal newspaper article. And if anything, it sort of just, catapulted me right into recovery because you didn't let me slow down. You kept me moving forward and working at it. And I think Grish had a lot to do with that. I can remember doing 12-step calls with him at the houseboat community in Sausalito late at night, dark, running into yard art outside on the piers.
It's evolved, slowly transformed and evolved into the purpose of one helping another stay sober. And I think Jim would attest to this. I certainly would. The more work I happen to do in sobriety, the more sober that I can maintain myself and support my family. I believe that Alcoholics Anonymous were serious drunks, and I was not a serious drunk. I was a highbrow, and I was a lawyer, and I couldn't be a serious drunk. Well, of course, on hindsight, I was a serious drunk, and thank God for the other bar and people in places like that who were able to make me see the light, and then make me able to 12-step people like Jim was talking about.
Sure. We're back at the time now when we incorporated in 1986.
Right.
We're now a nonprofit corporation, the Other Bar Inc., which one of the requirements is annual meetings. So our first annual meeting we did in conjunction with the State Bar Conference in Monterey. I don't know what you probably recall.
Yeah, I do.
We called the order the first annual meeting of the Other Bar in Monterey in conjunction with the State Bar and elected a president. From that first annual meeting, we've gone through a series of presidents. I was the president for 2 years, and John Gray and Kevin Donovan and Jim Heiting and Dave, Rick Owanzik. But anyway, the story is because of the annual meeting, it created the networking. So now we have an annual networking of Other Bar, and we rotate from Southern California to Northern California. And it's really a gathering of the Other Bar members from across the entire state of California. We get visitors from other states because they like what we do out here and want to be part of it. But the origin of our annual conference has to do with the annual meeting of the corporation itself, where we elect a new board of directors and every other year elect a new president.
Oh boy.
To be able to work with people over a long period of time. Tell us some thoughts that you have on the length of your sobriety and the memories you have in working with folks over a period of time.
Well, for me, I'm truly grateful for being sober. I had a tough time getting sober. I sobered up for a while, and then I started using again or drinking again. I didn't use, but I can remember back then when I think that was really the grabbing point, because I really didn't want to stop drinking, and I hadn't had any. I had an arrest and a DUI, and I got out of it. I just didn't really take myself serious about the significance of being able to stop and stay stopped. The progress has been terrific in the sense that we look back and see where we came and how many people we helped and how many people they helped, because a lot of people jumped in and just took after helping other people as a way to help themselves, and it worked out very well.
I think part of what, and so all the part of what people give to us in recovery remains with us forever. And so part of what we get as quote old timers is relationships with people that have to happen over an extended period of time that are just special. They're very, very meaningful because we help each other stay clean and sober one day at a time.
I think that's very true. I'll tell you, one of the joys of the Other Bar is the happy approach that they have, a pleasant approach that they have in helping other people. But then as I got sober myself, I realized that that's a process that I was going to go through, but I did go through. But I'll say this, that the Other Bar always had a kind of a nice smile on its face, that whole process. But the Other Bar was always kind of the lights on. It's we're going through the tunnel and the lights on. and it's doing real well, and you really felt good about yourself, and you felt that you could stay sober. But you know, you end up doing what's the best to do to attract, to address the disease that you have. And of course, any source, AA in particular, would be something that you would want to participate in. It was successful. Once you stop, we stayed stop, and it was a terrific way to help other people, and other people responded. And you know, it wasn't all a happy trip, but most of it was.
One of the things I was thinking, remembering really, is early in the history of the other bar, one of the decisions we made was to be public.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you know, the Alcoholics Anonymous, that all of us actually are very, very much a part of, has traditions. And one of the traditions is that you don't go public in the press, TV,
Right.
media. This is a private video for other bar members, but
Right.
so because we kept a separation because we didn't feel like we could violate the traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous with our MCLE presentations or being public. But one of the benefits over the years was dealing with, for instance, by being public, was judges.
Mm-hmm.
So you and I are both out of the Marin County-based
Mm-hmm.
other bar. You were also involved in San Francisco in the earlier years. But all of the judges in Marin County, for instance, know of the other bar,
Mm-hmm.
who we are, and who to contact.
Mm-hmm.
I was participating in a mediation program in Marin County recently. Great conversation with one of the judges in the back corridor, acknowledging that they know who we are, that they know what we do, that they appreciate our availability, that they know there's an answer. You know, one of the strongest leverages you can have in is it time for me to go into recovery or not is when you get a phone call from a judge or somebody calls you and says, you know, a judge is concerned about your behavior in the courtroom. Maybe it's about time you dealt with your addictions. The bottom line is we started as an organization of attorneys, judges, and people related to the legal profession willing to help others. And over that course of time, whether we have funding and can afford to pay consultants or whether we can't, we still are willing to help others. And I think it's the reason that we're going to go on into the future, because one way or the other, we are a group of attorneys, men and women, judges, legal personnel from around the state who are willing to respond to others in need. And as long as we keep that attitude, we're going to be available to do good, to help others, and keep ourselves clean and sober.
I agree with that, Jim. I think it's the goal of all of us is to help others and stay sober in the process. And as a matter of fact, I think that if I wasn't doing 12-step work, I would still be drinking, because sometimes I go out to visit on a 12-step call, and the guy would say to me, "Hey, let me have one more shot. You could share it with me, Ed." And I look at him and say to myself, "Holy Christ, that's me. That's me a few years back." And I think the whole process of the other bar and its work in 12-step is really what the key is, and that's where the joy is of seeing somebody who's been having chemical dependency problems clean up, get slow, and come back to the other bar. And you know, I went to another bar meeting this morning, and I look around the room and see a lot of people that have been there for a while, and realize that, but for the grace of God, I'm sitting in there too. And I remember how difficult it was for me to stop drinking and stay stopped. I stopped a dozen times, but I didn't stay stopped. So the other bar has been a very big part of my life in the sense of helping others. The only way I can really get out of myself is help somebody else. And helping somebody else, I see people who are in this throes of alcoholism, and thank God and look at that particular source and say to yourself, God bless, you're sober, and stay sober and help other people. And that's been kind of the motto of the other bar for as long as I've been around. We're going through the tunnel and the light's on.